time for an hour of hardcore hoops with the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro. There's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Let's get to the show basketball fans crave. Let's get inside the paint.
Good Wednesday morning, everybody. Clay Ferraro here, Ira Winderman there. And, I want to play a little bit off of what O said at the end of the segment there, where we spend the week like talking about, okay, well, are we going to talk about this? Are we going to talk about that? The fact is that this never slows down. And I think the win totals coming out, it gives us something to talk about. Looking ahead to the season, the loss of Dejan Giro, there's so much that we can get into. But I kind of like this rivalry topic, and I think especially since we like to make this show interactive. If you're watching this right now, drop in the chat. Give us who you think, and we'll kind of refer back to this as the show goes along. Give us who you think may be the Heat rival, and we'll talk about that as the show goes on. So a lot to get to, but Ira, got to ask, how you doing? Is it a good day in the Winderman household?
You know what? It's finally starting to slow down a little bit, Clay, and any chance I get to actually take an exhale and not have to worry about writing 7 days a week and just fulfilling my Ask Ira feature every morning at sunsentinel.com, I'm happier. So I know that the Dejan Giro thing was playing out. We'll talk a little bit later about the two-way contracts and Marcus Garrett finally getting signed. But now is sort of the time, I think, when the NBA sits back and takes stock. So you still have a few free agents out there, possibilities, guys like Paul Millsap, possibly J.J. Redick, some older guys who will fit in as we go along. It is not unusual for the Heat on the eve of camp to add another player. They've done that before. They did that with Gary Payton before their championship run. So we're not completely done, but I think this is a really good time to take stock, to look at the schedule, to look at the win totals, to look at other teams also. I think when we get into the season, there's going to be so much just go time. We're going to talk about the 3 games the Heat played in the last week, the 4 games they have coming up next. I think now's a good time to sort of look around the league also and see where the Heat stack up, because I know everyone talks about championship contention. And this is I think the word we're going to have to talk about most of the start of the season, Clay, is which are the Heat? Are they a competitor or are they a contender? I think they will be competitive with anyone. I think on any given night, the Heat can beat any given team. But can we honestly call them a challenger for a championship, a team that's a contender? To me, that's always been, you have to at least have the prospectus and the pedigree to get in the top 4 of your conference to be a conference finalist. I think right now there's some question about the Heat, and I think that's legitimate.
And it's interesting you mentioned top 4, because when you look at the win totals that just came out, I want to go down through some of these and see where you feel they fall here. But they would have them right in that top 4 mix, and so I think that would be good enough to get to that spot. And I've always felt this way, especially with the Heat, a team that has the pedigree of going in and doing things in the postseason, because the core is largely intact for this team that went to the bubble final, the NBA Finals in the bubble a couple of years ago. Just get there and get there. And you've mentioned this too, by the way, and I'm with you on this, that you don't want to be 7 or 8 because you don't want to fall into that play-in. But so you look at these over-under win totals that came out, and they've got the Heat, 4th in the Eastern Conference, which I think is fair. And I think, I don't even know, it may be even more than fair. They had them at 47.5 wins. I don't know if this is going to be a regular season team. I think it's going to be one of those teams that as the season goes along, they're going to make sure that their guys are healthy for the playoff run. So they've got, and I'm just going to do the Eastern Conference because they have the Heat tied for 8th overall, 4th in the East. Nets at 54.5 wins. Bucks at 53.5 wins. Sixers at 51.5 wins. And then the Heat right there at 47.5. Hawks and Celtics a game back at 46.5. So you got the Heat in 4th. And we've discussed this on the show before, though. The way those teams stack up, I agree with having those 3 teams, the Nets, the Bucks, and the Sixers, ahead of the Heat as far as the regular season goes. I question who the Sixers are, especially come playoff team. I have no clue who and what that team is going to be. And so you're really talking about, can the Heat compete with the Nets and the Bucks come playoff time?
Yeah, the Sixers are so interesting because I think when I look at the East now, I can assess most of these teams as I know who they are. I know the big three in Brooklyn is going to be Durant, Irving, and Harden. I know that. We know who the Bucks are. We saw them through a whole playoff run. I still don't know if Ben Simmons is going to be a 76er on opening night. I don't know if he's going to be with the Sixers at the trading deadline. So I don't know who Philadelphia is. They're a unique team with Ben Simmons. I'm not necessarily sure for the better. But if there is a move, if you're putting shooting in there, maybe a trade for CJ McCollum or something, they're a different team. That's the hardest team probably of all the teams in the playoff hierarchy. When I look at the East, is assessing the Sixers and what they are and who they are. Joel Embiid is great. He has his extension. He's the anchor to that team, which I don't know exactly how well that sits with Ben Simmons, who's always tried to be a co-star there. I don't know a guy like Danny Green a year older. I don't know if Seth Curry was a breakout season or who he was. Clay, the team I look at in the East that I'm very curious about, and no, it's not the Knicks, who I think are heading the other way, I think is the Boston Celtics. They have done, I like teams that do a subtle makeover. I think the Heat did a subtle makeover. They kept their top two stars in Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo. They brought in Kyle Lowry. They augmented. That's fine. I think the Celtics did the same thing. They said, we are a Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown team, and then we're going to maneuver through that and bring in other players. The fact that they have Al Horford, who's such a steady presence in a winning situation, they have that. The Dennis Schroeder thing, I'm not as sold on, because is he the guy who wants to show he could be a winner in a one-year contract, or the guy who wants to show he can have stats and get his money next time around? But that's a complete remix. This is a team that lost basically its main backcourt with Evan Fournier and Kemba Walker, and they've sort of reshuffled. So is that for the better or for the worse? So when I look at the East, I look at the Nets and the Bucks, I agree with you, Clay, as a top tier to themselves. I'm not so sure that the Celtics aren't in the next tier of three, which is the way I would put it, with the Celtics, the Sixers, and the Heat. And then I'd almost be curious to hear your opinion on a team that didn't do much major reshuffling this offseason, because they did it last offseason when they added guys like Bogdanovic and Gallinari. What do we make of the Atlanta Hawks? Do we see this constant upward growth curve right now with Trae Young and John Collins? Or do we see a team that had its moment and now that levels off? Would you put the Hawks on the cusp of the tier 2 I mentioned with the Heat, Celtics, and Sixers? Or do you think they're a step below or maybe a step above?
No, I do. I think they're right there. And I think there are going to be circumstances in every season that kind of dictate which one of these teams leaps up as far as regular season win. And look, it's mostly injuries. Again, we hate to talk about it, but there will be issues with COVID-19 again, and with players having to sit out certain stretches of games. So there are a lot of things that we can't factor. But yes, I think the Hawks are right there. And I don't think they're getting enough credit for putting together, I think, a complete team. Now, what I do wonder is when a team has that run, and I don't want to say out of nowhere, because I felt like that team all year was really talented. I feel like especially once Nate McMillan took over. I know that's easy to say because the win total went through. But they're so well constructed. I look at that team and I don't say, okay, this team is sorely lacking here. Maybe wing defender, but I mean, when Cam Reddish is right, you can look at them and say, hey,
DeAndre Hunter also, who wasn't even a playoff factor. Yeah.
Right. So I feel like they put together a really complete, nice team. Now, what I wonder is, when you have the whole offseason to kind of game plan against a team like that, do things start to fall back? And this, coaching staffs, when they get together, they're going to start to go through every team in the offseason and say, okay, what did we not do against this team to exploit their weaknesses that we can do this year? How do we attack this team? And I think you saw that with the Heat this past year. It was a shorter offseason, but teams got a chance to kind of look at them and say, so to answer your question, yes, I think they're right up there. The thing I really like about Boston too, and this is so obvious to say, but man, Jaylen Brown, I don't think people fully appreciate, because Jason Tatum gets all the love on that team, and rightfully so. People around the league know how good Jaylen Brown is.
Sure.
But what he brings as a two-way player, and I mean, just there's a reason why, when you hear Bradley Beal brought up in trade talks and you hear the Boston side of this thing, I don't know that they would be super quick to include Jaylen Brown in any sort of deal for him. So I feel like the combination of that, the remaking that you said, and I want to add this about Boston, then we'll move on. They needed somebody to come in and be that steady presence that you mentioned, because I do
Sure.
feel like it could get a little bit combustible with Marcus Smart there. And I love his competitiveness. He's the type of guy that you want in your corner. But I think that when things go wrong, you could see, what was it, the Portland game where he started to get got these fouls at the end of the game. I think a technical foul, got kicked out of it. So you bring in an Al Horford, and all of a sudden you've got somebody who is respected as a leader. But when Marcus Smart starts doing Marcus Smart things, can kind of tone things down a little bit. So I'm with you. And so I think when you look at these win totals, so let's bring it back. I like the way the regular season win totals are laid out. I actually happen to agree with the way they're laid out. If anything, I would say it wouldn't have bothered me if the Heat had been a little bit lower regular season wise, because I think they're going to play this season to be ready and rocking for the playoffs.
Except if we're talking about that, if you have Brooklyn and Milwaukee's 1-2, and if we're putting Boston, Philly, and let's say for argument's sake, Atlanta in as the next 3, all of a sudden, when you're teetering at the number 6 spot, the whole dynamic, like you mentioned with the play-in tournament, everything changes. You can't be where the Heat were last season, going into the final 2 weeks of the season, having to win twice in Boston just to avoid that number 6 seed. So I think you might have to push a little bit more and have a few more moments along the way. I think you're totally right, Clay. I think depth of your roster will matter a lot this season again, because of the COVID possibilities. We're seeing it in the NFL now. Fortunately, they have this 2-week buffer before the regular season starts, or else there would be concern there with their rosters. And that's my concern, Clay, when I look at this Heat starting lineup. So let's go through this, and this might bleed to the next break, but the next segment. But let's, for argument's sake, say the Heat starting lineup is Bam Adebayo, PJ Tucker, Jimmy Butler, Duncan Robinson, and Kyle Lowry, just for argument's sake, okay? Which means our next players off the bench, and jump in here and help me work through these permutations. Obviously, Tyler Hero would be in there.
Yep.
I'm thinking Dwayne Dedmon and Markieff Morris as my next 3. That takes me to 8.
Yep.
You know what? Tyler Hero, uneven second season, but you really need him. So that's one guy. Dwayne Dedmon wasn't even picked up till last year's buyout deadline, so there's concerns. Markieff Morris, God bless him, but a discard player, seemingly at this point in his career also. That's a little bit where my concern is with this Heat team, that if Bam misses time, significant drop-off. If Jimmy Butler misses time, significant drop-off. Same thing with Kyle Lowry. Now, you might go to me, hey, same thing in Brooklyn. God bless Patty Mills and what they have there. But when you're top-heavy with your roster, that happens. That's my concern, Clay. Clay, when you look at the bench of the Miami Heat right now, there still is time. There still could be moves. We know there's been no Kasiak Pallet gain to throw into that mix. Omar Yurtsev in Summer League, but let's have some perspective there. When you look at this Heat bench, though, and you give me that win total, and you say they're going to find a way, is this Heat bench good enough? And is this Heat bench trustworthy enough when you look at where this team might or might not be headed? While I fully appreciate the NBA is a league about stars and leading men.
Well, it depends, like you said, on who it is that's out. But no, not if you lose a Bam Adebayo, not if you lose a Jimmy Butler. And again, I want to make this clear. We're talking about regular season here. We're talking about win totals in the regular season, and if those players have to miss an extended period of time. Now, we haven't been able to see this roster on the floor to see, okay, if Jimmy Butler goes out, but you've still got a Kyle Lowry, does that, because you have somebody like a Lowry who's a facilitator, does that help things a bit? Victor Oladipo, whenever he comes
perfect
back,
name.
We've heard, okay, he thinks that he's going to be cleared and ready to roll by November. I still think the Heat are going to want to wait on that to make sure that he's closer to 100%. So, but no, and I'm glad you mentioned Brooklyn, because yes, there's nobody that can replace Kevin Durant. And yet, when you've got James Harden and Kyrie Irving, if you're just losing Kevin Durant, you're going to be okay. You're going to be able to keep your head above water for a certain stretch as the season goes on. So Ira, I have to see Kyle Lowry and Bam Adebayo working together before I can say that, yeah, losing Jimmy Butler for a stretch is something that this team can be okay with. And I do think we're talking about the potential for whatever these guys leaving might be. Look, this also goes back to the simple fact that, yeah, you do have a roster that's a little bit older with those top 2 guys. And Jimmy Butler is somebody who, I wouldn't call him old, but he's somebody who, yeah, we know he's probably going to miss some time because of how he plays the game. And Kyle Lowry's certainly getting up there a bit. So, yeah, I'm with you. I certainly think it's a concern regular season-wise, but I always fall back to this, man. Just get there and don't be the 7 or 8. You probably don't want to be 6, but just get there.
But it's interesting. And the name you mentioned, Victor Oladipo, I think I wrote it in my Sunday column at the Sun Sentinel. I think he's the swing state for the Heat. I think if Victor Oladipo comes back sooner rather than later, comes back closer to at least 75%, if not better, I think he could be the absolute swing vote for how this Heat season goes, at least in the second half of the schedule.
All right, so coming up next, I want to stick with this a little bit and talk about something else that you were mentioning in one of your columns, the loss of Dejan Jarreau, and did they potentially lose somebody that could have been there? But then I also want to talk about the schedule, and were there any things that stood out to you in looking at this? And obviously opening night is the one that we're going to talk about first. But that and a lot more coming up next on Inside the Paint, right here on Big O Show.
Reach out to Ira and Clay. Drop them an email at insidethepaint@yahoo.com. Chime in on the YouTube chat board. You're listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show.
There's no need to drive around South Florida wasting valuable time looking for a new or certified pre-owned Acura. Go to the #1 volume sales dealership in the Southeast United States. Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. Purchase with pace and space in a dealership tailored to your needs. From home buying to providing that personal touch. Contact the 2020 Satisfaction Award winner Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. 888-776-5123. That's 888-776-5123. Or visit them at 15601 Pines Boulevard in Pembroke Pines. If you're a Miami sports fan, then there's only one store to go to, and that's Caneswear at Miami Fanwear in Davie. They're your one-stop shop for all your inner Miami CF, Canes, Dolphins, Panthers, and Marlins merchandise. They have hats, t-shirts, game day jerseys, and so much more. Located at 2511 South University Drive in Davie, and open 24/7 online at caneswear.com or innermiamiwear.com. Call them at 954-835-5597. Caneswear, the spot where Inner Miami and all Miami sports fans shop.
This is the Big O Show. 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 This is the Big O Show.
When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Welcome back to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro. Let's get back to the guys that just updated their email from Prodigy to AOL. Here's Ira and Clay.
I'm going to go back to Prodigy after that. just to make Big O mad. Back here on Inside the Paint, Clay Ferraro here, Ira Winderman there. So, we started talking about the win totals and, obviously what goes into those win totals. And by the way, I do want to get to the rivalry chat, and Lenny brought up a good point here, and it was something we talked about before this started. I think the Bucks may be the closest thing to a rival since the Heat have seen in the past 2 seasons in the playoffs. So that kind of leads perfectly into what we're going to talk about with the schedule, Ira, which is the Heat open with the Bucks. And what I wanted to ask you is, I know there's this feeling, this sense, in particular in college football, when you start against a huge opponent, like Miami Hurricanes starting against Alabama, that it can add a little bit of juice to your offseason workout, stuff like that. Do you think there's anything to that with the Heat being able to have opening night against the defending champion Bucks and you played them in the playoffs and they swept you out? Or is this a case where these guys are professionals and they literally could not care less?
Well, I think, Clay, the Bucks could not care less. Here's the deal about a rivalry, and I've always said this. It has to come from both sides. You can't be my rival and they're looking over your head. The Bucks are looking over the Heat's head. The Bucks knew their dramatic playoff series with the Brooklyn Nets and how it ended that, a three-pointer away there from Kevin Durant and the Bucks season would be over. So the Bucks have, quote-unquote, bigger fish to fry. They have other teams. So if one team is looking over your head, if the Bucks arrive at FTX Arena and the Heat are going, I hope you guys are ready for this showdown, and the Bucks are going, showdown? What showdown? You're a sixth-place team who couldn't win a playoff game against us last season. That's why I don't think there's as much of a rivalry there. I think maybe you look even more at the Celtics or another team sort of in the Heat's range, that it means a little more, that there was a certain playoff history there. But that's why I have a hard time wrapping my head around the thought of the Bucks being a rival, because it doesn't go both ways. I guess you could say, Clay, but the Heat stole PJ Tucker away. But the bottom line is the Bucks let PJ Tucker go. They could have brought him back. They wanted their own upgrade. They were going to go in a different direction anyway. They didn't want to go into the tax for a player like that. That's why I have an awfully hard time looking at the Bucks as a rival. If that would have been an epic 7-game series or 6-game series, or they would have messed up or gotten into Giannis's head or something, then I could look at it as a rivalry. That's where I just have a problem. I know that the Orlando Magic have been a thorn to the Heat over the years. I know you have the Thibodeau-Jimmy Butler dynamic with the Knicks and their coach there and sort of some of the history. But it's really, I'm really perplexed and flummoxed almost when I try to think about who the Heat's rivalry is and what the rivalry games are in the schedule. Even LeBron coming back. We've gone so far down that road. It's not like he's coming in a Cleveland Cavaliers uniform. And for all the antipathy with the Cavaliers of LeBron leaving and coming back and then leaving again, the Cavs aren't even a factor in today's NBA. So I almost think the Heat have to build a rivalry. And you do that in the playoffs, and you do that with a sustained playoff run that at least 2 seasons ago, Clay, they did it against Indiana in the first round. And that was a budding rivalry at the time. They did it in the second round against the Bucks. We thought that was budding. They did it against the Boston Celtics. We thought that was for real a rivalry that those teams would meet. So I think the Heat need to have a little more playoff history with any of these teams, because honestly, I have the schedule in front of me, and they're just not a box I could circle and going, that's going to be a special rivalry night right there.
Well, and see, checking the chats, Clarence says he disagrees with you, and I happen to agree with Clarence on this. Like, I feel like with Milwaukee, yeah, you're right. Look, it was not close this past season. Mm-hmm. I would argue that it wasn't close the previous season the other way. And hey, the Heat caused the Bucks to go out and move heaven and earth to bring in Drew Holiday.
Correct.
And I still feel like, we can talk as much as we want about Giannis and what a phenomenal player he is, and he is, but the guy who changed that team from the team who got blown off the floor by Miami to the team that blew Miami off the floor and won a championship is Drew Holiday. Just what he brought. So when you cause a team to rethink who they are and go out and essentially, they traded away. They don't have the same. They traded away as many first-round picks as the Heat have just to get Drew Holiday. But it worked, and you give them credit for that. But I feel like we very quickly forget about what happened in that playoff series. And I don't disagree with you that they did not look like they belonged on the same floor with Milwaukee this past season. But I think that if you're going to say, and I happen to be on this side of it, that this was such a weird year. And the Heat just were not the same team that they were the year before. And oh, by the way, much like what the Heat did to the Bucks that caused them to go out and get Drew Holiday, I think the Heat kind of looked at themselves in many ways and said, all right, we're not close. We tried to run it back. It didn't work. Let's bring in somebody who may be a little bit older in Kyle Lowry, but we feel like with him, we can get close enough to kind of get over the hump there. So look, if the Bucks come in and they win that game by 30 on night one, and the Heat are sitting there and looking at themselves like, okay, here we go again, then yeah, maybe you start to wonder. But at the same time, it's still regular season game. But I read the famous Alonzo Mourning gif where he's sitting there, and I think they had actually just gotten their rings, right? When he's sitting there and he's just like, this, shaking his head and shrugs his shoulders. Like, you look at the score and they were getting blown out after winning a championship. I don't want to see that from the Heat. I want to see them go out
matter of fact,
compete.
Clay, do you remember the first meeting between the teams last year when Milwaukee came in? They played that back-to-back set the first weeks of the season.
Yes.
What was it, like a 53-point victory, 58 points? They destroyed them. So if the Heat can make a statement like that, then I would come around to your thinking. Then I would move alongside the chat group over there and agree with that a little bit more. So I guess what I need to see is this. How much does that resonate with the members of the Heat who are returning from last season's roster? How much does it? Remember, Jimmy Butler said, "Don't worry, when the playoffs come, I'll be ready and good to go." But he wasn't, and he was bad in that series. And Bam Adebayo obviously didn't stand up to Brook Lopez and was afraid to take that jumper. So yes, you might be right from this perspective. The Heat not only have to win that first game, but make a statement that resonates with Milwaukee. So the Bucks leave FTX Arena after that Thursday night game and they say to themselves, maybe it's not just about the Nets this season. Maybe it's not just about the Sixers this season. Maybe this Heat team is back and this is real. So I would put it that way. If the Heat make a statement in that game, then I think it changes. If the Heat play a mundane game, then I think it's different.
I'm glad you mentioned that first game. And I think you were actually the one who asked the question after the Bucks blew out the Heat after that first game. Because if you guys follow the post-game Zoom chats, Ira always gets the first question because he's Ira stinking Winderman, and he will get the first question.
I'm just quicker on the hand button there on the raise the hand feature because I sign on at halftime to the post-game chats there. I just try to get first in the group.
Ira's being modest. There is a level of respect there. But I found it really interesting after that first game, and the soundbite is playing in my head right now. What did Eric Spoelstra say after that game? He said, talking about the Bucks, he said that looked like a team who has been thinking about this game for a long time.
Yes.
And so I think twofold. Number one, I think that kind of adds to the thought that the Heat have probably been thinking about this game since it was circled on the schedule. Like, if Eric Spoelstra is sitting there and telling you that he thought the Bucks were thinking about that Heat game and blew them out by 50, that's the way Spo's brain must work. And so he's thinking the same thing about this game. But secondly, if you truly believe that a team has been thinking about that game, and I think the comments that the Bucks had, especially after their playoff series, would reflect this. If they're thinking about you, you're a rival. You may not be quite to that level yet where you can call it a Heat-Knicks type rival, and they're not. But I think the seeds are being sown. Let's put it that way. But to your point, you got to have it happen a few more times in order for it to actually come.
And again, that'll be the Bucks' second game of the season. They're playing a nationally televised opening night, get their rings game, I believe, against the Nets on that Tuesday night. So the Heat will be idle on Tuesday, watching that game, idle on Wednesday. Milwaukee will be traveling in. So it certainly sets up well for the Heat for their home opener, hopefully full fans in attendance, something like it was like at the end of the season against the Bucks. And if they make a step on your throat moment there, then Clay, I will come around and say, okay, the Heat are now woke. They're now ready for this Milwaukee Bucks team. It means something to them. And again, there is the PJ Tucker factor. And here's a guy who won a championship, was celebrating, and all of a sudden he gets a call from the front office of the Bucks who say, hey, we love what you did. You were a heart and soul player, but we ain't going into the tax or excessively into the tax just for you. So I'll be curious to see how he comes out in that game as well.
So I'm looking at the rest of the schedule, and I'm going to ask you what stands out to you about it. But I'll tell you what stands out to me is that you can no longer look at the schedule, especially with these Eastern Conference games, and say, okay, that's going to be a relatively easy night. And you still got some. I mean, Cleveland is Cleveland. I want to see what Detroit is with Cade Cunningham. Like, you still got some that the teams haven't taken an enormous step up. But, man, like, you look at some of the teams that you used to count on being able to beat, like a Chicago. Well, all of a sudden, man, that team's gone out and largely remade themselves. Atlanta, obviously, we've seen what they've done over the last couple of years. Toronto is always going to be a pain in your neck. Like, it's really hard to look at this schedule and pick out the teams, in particular in the Eastern Conference, that you can say, okay, you may lose the game because it's an NBA team and it's full of pros, and but like all of these games top to bottom, man, it's going to be a fight. And that goes back to what you were saying last week, which is you could make the case that top to bottom now, the East has surpassed the Western Conference. So when I look at this schedule, Ira, and I look at that win total, it's going to be tough because I don't see the games where you can show up and coast anymore and potentially get a win outside of maybe when you go to Cleveland.
I see three teams like that. I agree. Obviously, Cleveland is what they are. They're young. They'll come along. They got to figure out this whole Kevin Love thing, and I'm curious to see how that plays out. I think Detroit realizes, even with Cade Cunningham, you don't just shoot right back up. You do it deliberately. You do it slowly. So I think they're sort of pacing themselves. And I don't see anything from the Orlando Magic, even though I thought they had a good draft and they have good players. I want to see what Jonathan Isaac comes back as. But and I know for the Heat, they're a thorn because there is a rivalry. That's interesting, Clay. That's the opposite almost of what I was talking about Milwaukee. I don't see the Heat seeing the Magic as a rival, but I do see the Magic seeing the Heat as a rival because they've always wanted to get to that level. They've had a couple of runs. They had the Shaq run. They had when Stan Van Gundy went in and took them to the finals. But they haven't had that Heat consistency in the state. But I look at those three teams, I put them aside. So otherwise, you're talking about 12 teams going for at least 10 spots in the play-in. One of the teams you didn't mention, I think the Washington Wizards at least have a more complete roster. Yes, you've taken Russell Westbrook's triple-doubles out of it. But now all of a sudden with Montrezl Harrell going in there, with what Kyle Kuzma is or isn't, I think there's a more complete group for Bradley Beal to work with. Charlotte did their own upgrade in the offseason also. I think they're going to be tough. So again, I think even to get to those 10 play-in spots, there's going to be a challenge for some teams. But this Heat team can't do that anymore. They can't say we're going to pick and cherry pick this game and that game. Two reasons. One, the lesson was last year with COVID. You never know when your time of being shorthanded is around the corner. Right, Jimmy Butler misses 10 games last season because of pandemic protocols, and it throws the whole finish out of whack. Again, one more victory. All of a sudden, you're in that 4-5 opening round seed. You're playing either Atlanta or the Knicks. You're probably talking about a completely different outcome. Second round going against Philadelphia. So you know how important one game is. And going back to the win totals you mentioned at the top of the show, again, the Heat are only listed, I believe, one victory ahead of the Celtics, one victory ahead of the Hawks. So it shows you how every game is going to matter there. The one swing team I'm so curious about, and Clay, you could look at the over-under totals there. I think they have the Knicks only at like 41.5 or 42.5, relatively low in the mix and almost a downgrade there. I find it really interesting that a team that added Kemba Walker, a team that added Evan Fournier, and really didn't lose anything, is all of a sudden looked to take a step back. And is that a case of a one-season classic overachievement by Tom Thibodeau, by Julius Randle perhaps outplaying his pedigree? But I'm really curious about the Knicks because you know what? Say what you want or what you don't want to say. The Heat did sweep them last season, but the Knicks finished ahead of the Heat. So are we disrespecting the Knicks too much, or are we looking at last season's Knicks as just a one-off?
I'll say this. I think they're disrespecting them from a regular season perspective. They have them behind the Pacers. They have the Pacers at 42.5 wins and the Knicks at 41.5. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I think from a regular season perspective, because I think the Knicks are a try-hard team that is going to go out there and give the most effort of any team in the league on an 82-game basis. And that's Tom Thibodeau. And that's great. And that works really well in the regular season. But then you get to the playoffs and you play the more talented teams and you get your doors blown off.
Yes.
And that's what happened. So from a regular season perspective, I'm not a betting man. I'm not gonna go out to Vegas and do this, but I see 41.5 wins for the Knicks. Like, that's a team that's going to go out there and they're not going to lose to a lesser talented team because they're gonna try hard. They're going to be the higher effort team. The team with the most effort matters in the regular season because in the playoffs, the effort level is up here for everybody.
Except here's my problem. Here's my problem with the Knicks is we know Julius Randle's their best player, and he certainly stepped up last season. Clay Ferraro, who is the New York Knicks' second best player?
I mean, I think you're hoping that at some point RJ Barrett can make that leap. I like adding. I think the fact that you've added Fournier and Kemba Walker, I feel like you can kind of hedge your bets a little bit there.
Each will have their games. I agree with that.
Yeah,
that each will have their moments, and that Quickly was a guy who stepped up and had his moments. But you know what? It's like when you and I were talking about at the top of the show. When you go to the top of the conference, you have Durant, Irving, and Harden, your big three. you have Middleton, Drew Holiday, and Giannis, your big three. In Philadelphia, you at least have a big two. Say what you want about Ben Simmons, but you know they have a big two in Simmons and Embiid. The Heat, another three with Adebayo, Butler, and now adding Lowry. Atlanta's a team I question who beyond Trae Young is the next guy. Is it John Collins continuing to emerge? Or is that a Knicks-like team where sometimes it's Danilo Gallinari, sometimes it's Bogdanovic, sometimes it's Hunter, and they're just sort of going through all the things there. And I think the NBA has shown you need consistently top guys, which almost brings me back to the Heat. And I know we're up against a break, but hey, this is what you do in radio. To the Heat, are you putting Bam Adebayo as one of the guys I just mentioned? Are you putting him in the groupings of a Durant, of an Irving, of Kyrie Irving? Are you putting him there with a Holiday, a Middleton, and a Giannis? Are you putting him in there yet with a Simmons and an Embiid? That's why I think Bam Adebayo is such an important piece here. I know he's a star. Will Bam Adebayo, with his skill set, Radio Tease, we can come back after the break on this one, will Bam Adebayo with his skill set ever be a superstar?
We'll talk about that after the break. You're on Inside the Paint on the Big O Show.
You're listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a good rack? Pallet Rack City. Sports fans love a place with great food, cold drinks, and TVs everywhere. That's why sports fans love Sports Grill and their 7 amazing locations. Check out the Bird Road location at 11481 Southwest 40th Street in the back corner of the West Bird Shopping Center. Sports Grill is also now offering some great employment opportunities. All kinds of positions are now available from kitchen to hosting. Call for more information at 305-485-8845. From wraps to salads to amazingly delicious specialty dishes, Sports Grill is the home to the legendary special grilled wings. Since 1987, Sports Grill, good food, good drink, and good friends.
This is the Big O Show. 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 This is the Big O Show.
There's no need to drive around South Florida wasting valuable time looking for a new or certified pre-owned Acura. Go to the #1 volume sales dealership in the Southeast United States. Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. Purchase with pace and space in a dealership tailored to your needs. From home buying to providing that personal touch. Contact the 2020 Satisfaction Award winner Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. 888-776-5123. That's 888-776-5123. Or visit them at 15601 Pines Boulevard in Pembroke Pines.
When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. If it's hardcore hoops you desire, make sure you subscribe to the Big O Radio Show and never miss an episode of Inside the Paint. Let's get back to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro.
Welcome back. Home stretch here on Inside the Paint. Ira Winderman clearly checking his phone to get some scoops to bring us in the last segment of this show.
Basically just to see what Woj is reporting while we're on the air. Let's not kid ourselves. That's what we do. I just let the Woj-Shams war play out, and I just pontificate and reflect on that. And shockingly, Dejan Jarreau wasn't big enough for either of them. So I'll bring you the little stuff.
But look, we just said that the Pacers' win total was ahead of the Knicks. Clearly, the Dejan Jarreau move shifted the power in the conference. So we've been talking about win totals and whether we think they're fair and all that. And a big factor with all of this is depth of teams. So when you lose somebody like a Dejan Jarreau, Ira, and this kind of gets us into the weeds of what happens, the mechanisms of two-way contracts, things like that. Is this the type of situation where when you've got a season like this, where you're going to have to deal with probably an unusual level of attrition, is this the type of move that could come back and potentially bite the Heat down the road?
You know what? I think it might be the opposite, Clay. On one hand, I hate losing a quality prospect, and Dejan Jarreau was very good for the Heat when it came to where they stood in Summer League. Total rebounds, he led them in Vegas, obviously played more games than Omer Yurtseven. Far and away the Heat's assist leader in that competition, third on the team in scoring, behind only Max Strus and Omer Yurtseven. But the lesson from last season in COVID showed us that your two-way players very well might play meaningful minutes. Who were the Heat's two-way players last season? Max Strus and Gabe Vincent. They were on the court a lot. Maybe more than you wanted, but those kind of things happen. So I think what the Heat are doing is they're saying, you know what? This might be a year where we have one developmental two-way guy, but one more NBA-ready two-way guy. I think of the competition with Dejan Jarreau and Marcus Garrett, the undrafted guard out of Kansas, who was a Naismith Award Defensive Player of the Year 2 years ago, a runner-up last year. I think they simply preferred him in one of those spots, didn't want to lock into similar Briante Weber, Patrick Beverley type of players, so they moved in another direction there and maybe limited their offer. At least that's what I think as of now. So I'll be curious to see who the two-way guys are. But I think unlike in a typical year where you say, you know what, get a couple of two-way guys, stash them over in Sioux Falls, let them develop for a season. Again, the Heat are carrying a 14-player roster, but Udonis Haslem doesn't play, 13. Victor Oladipo doesn't play the first half of the season, 12. KZ Okpala can't play, 11. So all of a sudden you're down to available bodies if a couple of guys, protocols and contact tracing, and you need other guys. So I'm really curious. This year, the NBA has been modifying their two-way rules during the pandemic. Last year, unlimited play. It used to be you couldn't be with the team for more than 50 total days, even including practice time. Now it's 50 games out of the 82. So you'll be able to play roughly 2/3 of the schedule, at least on the active roster. So I think that's where the Jarreau thing went a little bit sideways, is the Heat wanted to take a little bit more measured approach. Sometimes you act quickly, you're in better shape. Sometimes you sit back and wait, something better happens. So I think that's sort of how that played out.
Interesting. And so let me ask you this, kind of the inner workings of this thing. And we've seen the NBA, I feel like, do a really good job of being flexible when it comes to these roster situations as the year goes on. Do you think that that's coming down the pipe, that they're going to add a little bit more flexibility there? We've seen the NFL do it. They did it last season. Turns out they're going to do it again this year with, between practice squad players, the number of players that you can keep in your building. And with them, it was to avoid the onboarding process. But I think you could make a similar case in the NBA that with all these protocols, not only are you going to lose players, but you would potentially have to deal with getting guys in your building, some sort of an onboarding process with a lot of. So do you think that this is something where the NBA could end up being a bit flexible as the year goes on, and the Heat could potentially benefit from that?
Oh, I think you have to. Look, we're all looking at what's happening even now in the NFL and the Cole Beasley situation and coaches being sidelined. And the NBA has been very reactive during this. They are not going to get in the situation they were last year where you had eight-player teams playing the Heat twice in Philadelphia, barely having enough until Tyler Hero was cleared the day before the first of those two games. So there'll be a flexibility as far as who's available, what you can do, whether they add another roster spot. They want to make it as close to real as possible. Everyone thought, Clay, I think you also, we'd be through this, that we'd be in a much better place than we are now, but we're not. And the season's about to start. And we still don't know the rules even at FTX Arena for fans right now. Will you have to be vaccinated? What's working? What's going on there? The players are already back in their testing protocol in the NBA. That is already starting right now, getting them ready. So, yes, I think there's going to be a lot in motion there. There might be a pool of players you might be able to bring in. You're right, Clay. You might be reluctant to send your players out to your G League team because of infection possibility there, traveling through a G League schedule, which is commercial travel, versus traveling through an NBA schedule, which is private planes that the NBA sets up just for the situations like this. So It's going to be interesting. All I can say is this. The end of last season, the Heat had an entirely vaccinated roster. Now, they have new players. They have players coming in from other places. You don't know as far as the need for a booster shot, what the reaction players are going to have there, what the timing is, even availability of boosters. You remember, Clay, when this whole thing started, there was a question, why should NBA players jump the line? Adam Silver, we're not going to jump the line. We're going to wait. So I'm almost curious when we get to the booster situation, where are the Heat going to stand on that? Will there be reactions? Will players have to miss a day or two because of the third booster shot, the third shot overall they get? It's crazy. I so thought we'd be away from this. I've already booked all my travel for the season as far as hotels. I have a room in every single city this season because you can cancel hotels. But I'm being very careful in booking my travel because, again, are we on Zoom? Are we in the locker room? The NFL came out yesterday and said no reporters other than team media, social media in the locker room. So I still don't know what the season is going to look like. I don't know what the interview process is going to look like. And you know what? Every time, Clay, I talk to the teams, they don't know either.
They don't know
this
either.
whole thing. It's like society in general. It's like school kids and everything. You literally don't know from day to day what's going on.
Well, we're dealing with it in a big way too. And so, I think it's, yes, you have to be flexible. I do think because we've been here before, it's twofold. And again, not to get too far down this road, but I feel like, as families, we've dealt with this. And, I think people are really resilient. Kids are really resilient. So even though you thought you were going one way and ends up going the other, you can bounce back. And I think in many ways, the NBA is going to be able to do that as well. Like, I think everybody was happy to think that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And so anyway, hopefully we're able to get to a point where it's a little bit more normal. But I think when you're talking about roster numbers, you start to look at, you mentioned the depth and how that plays in as the season goes on. And I look at, and this is not somebody who would qualify as, clearly a two-way contract type player, given the extension that he just got. But when you look at the Heat roster and somebody like Josh Richardson, who just got a deal in Boston and an extension there, and they feel good about him, is he somebody, when you look back at how the Heat have kind of constructed their roster over the last few years, could you make a case that he's somebody that when you get down to that level, 6th, 7th, 8th guy, and you're going to have to pay guys at that point, is he somebody who could have made sense as maybe somebody who got away that could have helped there?
Well, it's interesting because Josh Richardson was traded away, had to be traded away in the Jimmy Butler deal, one, to get Philadelphia to bite and be part of that. So he went to Philadelphia, had sort of an uneven season, wasn't the type of leader they wanted, wasn't the shooter they wanted. They traded him to Dallas for Seth Curry. He went to Dallas, and I think Josh went through a bad COVID experience, by the way, also. Actually, a couple of them. This time was stranded in a hotel in Denver for 10 days. Never had the season they wanted. Simply fell out of favor in Dallas. They basically sold him off to Boston to get rid of him. But a nice complimentary piece. And when I look at, remember when they came in the same year, Rook 1 and Rook 2, him and Justice Winslow? I've always felt this about Josh Richardson. He's willing to be more of a chameleon type of player. Okay, I'm not a starter. I'll be the best reserve I can. Okay, I'm struggling offensively with my three-point shot. I'll be a defender. I'll be what you want. And I think that's why he winds up in Boston and gets an extension, which is actually an extension of the rookie extension he signed with the Heat because you respect that. Then you look at a guy like Justice Winslow, who even a young team like Memphis that basically made their big trade, gave up their big chips, not only in Andre Iguodala, but in Jay Crowder. To get someone like Justice Winslow. Contract expires, what nothing to do with him. He gets a lower level exception just because the Clippers sort of take a flyer. So, when I look at Josh Richardson and look at him in Boston, I see him as another guy when we talked about the Schroeder acquisition and the Horford thing, that he can help him a little bit more. Those are the kind of players you want. And you know what, Clay? This is a perfect full cycle to what we were talking about at the end of the previous segment in this. You look at players who were jack of all trades, who can do a lot. Josh Richardson could pass, he could shoot, he could defend, he could be a component. But I think we all realized at a certain point he was not going to be a star and he was not going to be a superstar. He's found his NBA place, which cycles us back to Bam Adebayo and what he is or what he isn't.
I'm so glad you brought that up and delivered on that tease.
Well, you know what? I know in radio thing, the worst thing is when you get to that last minute and you realize like, we haven't done that yet. So I wanted to get back to this. But here's the thing about Bam Adebayo. He was an all-star 2 seasons ago, not an all-star last season. That he got off to an uneven start. Do you think there will be a point, Clay Ferraro? Let's just do this in 2 segments, okay? 2 parts. Do you think there will be a point in the next 3 years when we call Bam Adebayo a superstar? Do you think there will be a point during his career when we call Bam Adebayo a superstar?
Well, I think the answer to that question is going to be the same. And whether it's yes or no, like it's going to happen in the next 3 years if it's going to happen or it's not going to happen at all. I think he is, and I think for this reason.
Superstar. Interesting.
I go back to what Pat Riley said at the end of this past season. And he said something, honestly, that I've felt for a while. That he said Eric Spoelstra was asking Bam to do too much. And I think at some point, you zoom in on what somebody does well and you maximize that. Now, I don't know right now in the building what they're going to ask Bam to focus on, but we know 2 things about Bam. Number one, he is a maniac competitor. Like he is somebody that, man, there was the story by Zach Lowe where he went out to dinner with Karl Anthony Towns and I think a former coach, and somebody made some comment about how Towns was, maybe one day you'll be on Towns' level. And the next day, I mean, Bam just like was seething over this for 24 hours. The next night he went out there and absolutely annihilated Towns on the floor. Like there's just that thing in him, and I'm not comparing him to Michael Jordan, but like there's this thing in him that MJ had and that so many great competitors have had that like, when there's some level, Team USA. Sure. I mean, he like the Greg Popovich thing. I don't think he's ever going to let that go. And so like so to me, it's he has the will, the want to. And I also think that he's somebody who takes really well to coaching. And so in that building, if you have one vision for him now moving forward, which is not, we're going to make you go out there and be Nikola Jokic on offense and Giannis on defense. It's allowing him to focus on certain things, whether it's the corner 3-pointer, whether it's working with Kyle Lowry on pick and rolls and getting some of those open looks that we saw guys like Serge Ibaka in the past,
sure.
And to a certain extent, Pascal Siakam, I think you could see him develop into that type of offensive player and then being the type of defensive player. Now, with that said, I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and I hate to do this, but like to me, superstar is somebody that passes the my mom test. Like if I ask my mom who certain guys are, like she can tell you who LeBron is. Right. She can tell you who Kevin Durant is. Oh, he's the one who said, oh, you're the real MVP. Talking about Steph Curry passes that. Like, sure. I don't think you're talking about him talking about it being like a transient type player, superstar to that level. But all NBA player, absolutely, 100%, yes. And that's so for me, all NBA player is the level that I'm going to put on.
And I think your most cogent point there is, and we've spoken about this in the show before, and we'll talk about it going forward. Is there too much on his plate where he's sort of being asked to be a master of all things, and yet doesn't excel at anything specific? I think right now he excels defensively. We agree with that, and his ability to switch and everything. But is having him run around with his head cut off and switching onto every point guard and defending on the perimeter, not allowing him to be the rebounder he could be, right. Not allowing him to be the rim defender he could be, right. and also just scoring. Jimmy Butler would much rather facilitate. Yes. He's not going to be a guy who's going to try to say, Jimmy Butler will never say, I'm going to try to lead the league in scoring. Kyle Lowry has always trended toward helping others as much as getting his own. That's something that he lives for also. So there will be 2 guys who will be interested in feeding Bam Adebayo more offense. And I'm just curious. Remember a couple of years ago when he predicted with Dwayne Wade what his final numbers were going to be? And it was like 18, 11, and 6 or whatever. And he was right there with the numbers. I almost wonder if you ask Bam Adebayo, what's your ultimate upside scoring average-wise? I do wonder what that number is. Is it 20? Is it 22? Can he be a 24? Does he want to be a 24? And that's what I'm curious also, because again, and we'll be discussing this in the next 5 weeks leading to camp, who does score for the Miami Heat? And do you need more Bam Adebayo points to fill that pie chart a little bit better? So I think in a way you're asking Bam to go outside of his comfort zone in a different way. Before you've asked him to go outside his comfort zone by doing everything. Maybe this time you have to say, okay, Bam, you have this nice big comfort zone. Pick 3 things. Pick 3 elements. Rim deterrence, rebounding, scoring. And I'm just curious, if you do that with him, could you actually wind up with a better player by being, to some degrees, it sounds odd, a less complete player.
No, I 100%. You know, just because somebody can do something doesn't mean they should. And
Right.
we did something last year ahead of one of the specials where we interviewed John Calipari, and got to hear from him. And he said, Bam has created this new position in the NBA, the point center. I mean, I would say Nikola Jokic probably created that even before that. But I would say that just because Bam can do that doesn't mean he should. And I think, look, there are certain points in the game, right? Like there was a stat yesterday, I think it was Simon Smith who posted this, that Duncan Robinson, I think, was 47% on three-pointers when Bam passed him the ball.
Yes.
And
Real
a lot,
chemistry,
almost all of those were dribble handoffs, by the way, or going around, kind of setting a pick and doing that. So there are certain points in the half-court offense where you don't want to eliminate that, but you want Bam to be on the receiving end of a lot of that. And Ira, for me, and we'll end on this, the most compelling storyline is Bam Adebayo. And who does he become, especially on the offensive end of the floor? I'm less concerned about the defense because I feel like you can have him do what he's done there. And especially like when he gets switched off onto a point guard, I'm okay with that as long as Duncan Robinson doesn't end up guarding Nikola Jokic or Rudy Gobert, as we saw a few times, or DeAndre Ayton. But I think especially offensively, it is fascinating to me who Bam Adebayo is and who he can be if you ask him, you know what? Don't worry about being a point center anymore. Go out there and be peak Serge Ibaka offensively. Go out there and be the type of player that Kyle Lowry has made before. And I'll end on this. Kyle Lowry said this in his introductory Zoom. And again, that you may have even asked him this question. And he said, my job is to make Bam Adebayo think he's Superman.
Yes.
And so I think there's already a feeling in that organization of who they want to make Bam into. And I'll tell you what, the best way to make Bam do that is tell him, to your point about what his ultimate numbers could be, go out there and tell Bam, I don't think you can average 30 points a game. He'll go out there and average 30 points a game because that's who he is.
To be continued.
There you go.
Talk.
There you go. All right, Ira, great stuff today. Inside the Paint, always fun. And we will catch up with you guys again next week. And, man, this offseason thing never stops. Never stops.
Does.
What, September 28th camp?
Yep.
Man.
Less than 6 weeks.
Oh, let's get
back
to
at it.
All right, guys. Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.
Been listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro, exclusively on the Big O Radio Show. Search Big O Radio Show on most platforms. Subscribe and smash the like button to support Inside the Paint. If you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business, there's only one choice: Pallet Rack City.